Welcome to the Disrupt Education podcast. My co-host Alli and Peter, that's me, are here. We are going beyond the score in this series and talking deeper education, learning pathways, connecting academia, reality, our whys. What else are we talking about here, Alli?
Well, today we have such a special guest of somebody who's doing the work that we have been kind of leaning into in this series, which is really people out there literally living day to day to connect academia to reality and really create those systems of change and programs and all of that. So, Joel, we're really excited to have you on this series that we're doing because we've really kind of gone into like, well, what's wrong with the traditional models, or what are some things that people aren't thinking about, but then like, how can we actually do this work? And you're in that work. And so we're really excited to have you here.
Yes. Thank you. So yes, we have Joel Vargas here. He's the Vice President of Programs at JLFF, which is Jobs for the Future. Again, thank you. I'm going to just kind of piggyback off of Alli's wonderful. Yeah, we're so excited to talk to you. Thank you, Joel, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Peter and Alli. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So that was like a really brief kind of introduction of who you are. Can you kind of expand on, what is JLFF and what is your role of the VP of Programs?
Sure. Well, we're a nonprofit organization. Our work is national. It is in its 40 years, always been about trying to design and scale up solutions that can really transform America's education and workforce training systems so that more people have, equitable chances at advancing economically. And right now our systems are not up to that task. Been proud to have been with the organization for 20 years, so have seen some of the progress that we've been able to promote through new kinds of innovative solutions. We tend to, identify promising practices and models in the field. We'll sort of document, codify those approaches, go out and try to tell the world about them. And about, sort of the inner workings of those so that people don't have to recreate the wheel. We work with researchers to understand whether these are having an impact because we want to promote things that have an impact. We talk to policymakers about the kinds of conditions that are needed to make these kinds of solutions when they're working more of the norm for young people and adults so that they are able to advance economically. So that's, kind of a broad overview. It's been, I can give you just sort of one example that I know we'll talk about more, but my work is focused over the years, even though my portfolio is quite large and encompasses, kind of work on for young adults and then adults as well, research, you name it. But my specialty over the years has been on incorporating career and college experiences into high school. Yeah. Just trying to make that more of a norm for young people, because we've seen that's a very powerful approach to having young people get a firmer foot in their future economically.
I know for me, that's something that we've really explored in this series is, creating kind of student agency and getting students a place to kind of hang their hats on their learning, which kind of gets into, it sounds like what the work you're doing with how do you kind of grow students at the high school level and incorporate post high school experiences. So can you talk a little bit more about like some of the programming that you've seen that's really been effective at your work at JLFF?
Sure. Great question. Can tell you a little bit more about how I ended up backing into this at a real critical time in my career. But the example I can think of that really kind of launched me down this road and then like continue to just push it and promote it in any way that we can. Yeah, when I started at JLFF, we were the managing, coordinating organization for something called the Early College High School Initiative. And early college high schools are small schools designed so that young people can earn an associate's degree or up to a year to 2 years of transferable college credit by the time they finish high school. If you rewind when we started doing that, it's still a mouthful and there's a lot there. Like I would say that to people back in the day and they would say, oh, so that's for gifted and talented kids. And I would say, no, actually, we're going for young people who typically would not finish high school, would not enter college, or if they went, they would not finish. And they would say, well, that's a weird idea. Why would you accelerate students who aren't ready, so to speak? And I can, again, going back to personal experiences, it just made intuitive sense to me, given my personal experience, given what I knew from research about innovative sort of education designs when I was in graduate school. And I said, this is kind of a crazy idea, but it just might work and blow some people's minds. And you know what? I was so proud that I stuck with it. We stuck with it. I had the nice, fun job of talking to policymakers about, like, what would you do to actually enable these schools to be piloted, and then if they work, to actually try to make more of your high schools like this. And fortunately, the early evidence on these designs was very promising, and they were affirmed by the most rigorous research that just keeps coming out with positive impacts from these schools. So it was this notion of, in some ways, if you just, one of the best, most effective ways to break the silos and the sort of cracks in the pipeline, if you think of the, high school to college to career pipeline, which I'm increasingly questioning. But back in the day, that was my start, was we said, well, why don't you just kind of like remove the boundaries and see what happens? And that was easier said than done. And there were some amazing practitioners who made that work, and some courageous policymakers who took a bet on the model. And the results have been just tremendous. So I would say my work since seeing that kind of become so successful is, let's make that the norm. And let's make sure it's also connected to a career experience and post-secondary credentials that can get someone a good job when they're done, even as soon as high school. Although they can also keep going. The good preparation would enable them to keep going on in their education. So anyway, a long answer to your question. I think if I remember it correctly, that's been my driving sort of why, here at this job and in my career. As
we kind of started to state it, going beyond the score, we see that as kind of the one of the biggest boundaries, right? You have these scores, you have these grades, and you have all these somewhat policy interruption, which I love the fact that, you are talking about speaking with policymakers and helping them kind of understanding and gaining momentum there. That's got to be probably one of the most difficult jobs, but I feel like that is one of the biggest challenges. I'm a high school business educator. I'm right with you, man. So we've doubled the size of our business department in 2 years, even in a pandemic, because our students, our families, and the next generation of families, statistically really want these skills coming in, as well as an interest and a curiosity in learning. What is it like talking to policymakers that maybe are on the fence? Now, you had some people take the bet, but what can you describe that process, or what does that look like? Because thank you for saying that, because everybody's like, teachers need to do this or administrators need to do this, but we're bound in this box. And I feel like that is a major, major blocker that happens. And we're all just kind of running around in this box where it's legally, this is what we have to do. So yeah, I kind of wanted to just have you unpack those kind of stories there. The bet takers and, the bet makers, and also those that are on the fence.
Yeah, well, I would say one thing, it's a great question, Peter, and I'll probably be all over the place in my answer, and just you're taking me back in history, because the first thing I answer now is it wasn't always like this, but I would say increasingly there's an increasing openness to doing something different, because I think we see, and that was accelerated by the pandemic, but it was kind of happening before, that there's certainly, you've probably seen all this surveying of Gen Z young people coming up. And they're saying, like, I don't know if I want to go to college. Like, what's the return on investment in that? At the same time, they're going like, I probably have to go to college and get a BA because that's what everybody said. That's what employers are looking for, right? But there's more real circumspection about that. And, I think policymakers are sort of saying, yeah, why do you have to wait so long? Do you need a BA to do that job? And, what about the data that suggests there are some post-secondary credentials that actually have a higher return on investment in terms of future earnings, wages, than a BA, depending on the field and major? Like, help us sort that out because this seems kind of irrational. So there is a real openness to sort of different kinds of solutions that rearrange the sequences, as you I forget the term you use, but like, kind of the gates that we've set up as part of our traditional system. Like, why are they like that? Those were established pretty much during the industrial age. Why are we making young people sort of take a prolonged time out and sort of say, we're getting you ready for the next thing. So just do your work so you'll be ready. And like, now you see the dissatisfaction and patience of Gen Z. It's like, I need to, in the pandemic, it was a necessity for a lot of them. Like, I need to make money now. I got family members who are hurting now. I can't take time out to learn. Like, I gotta earn. So, we need solutions that kind of integrate the learning and earning. I would say rolling back though, there have always been, there's always been some agreement, probably still is the case today, about the what, right? Like, it should look like this. And we're very eloquent about that. I'm not saying here's what it ought to look like. The hard part is, to your point, Peter, it's the how. When you start getting to, okay, so maybe the money ought to start moving a little differently. And maybe who is qualified to teach what across different boundaries of K-12 and post-secondary education. Maybe we ought to rethink that. And maybe, what college teachers do ought to, in their qualifications, maybe they ought to resemble a little bit more what high school teachers, how they've been prepared, and vice versa. And, those are the conversations, like, how do you do that? Is the tough part, because we have the boxes that we do. And even people who, like teachers and college instructors, who say, like, that actually makes a lot of sense because I've taught high school kids. I'm a college instructor and actually enjoyed that. But, when it comes to creating systems then that generate, at scale, like those kinds of qualifications that look very different than the boxes we have now, it can be a little perplexing for some. So I would say the things we have tried is you got to try little experiments and pilots and, show the results from those. It's a slow strategy. And we've called for more radical change too. Yeah. Because I think you've got to keep holding out that, that challenge to folks, the audaciousness, like, here's what we're trying to head for. But then you have to show ways that you can begin to get there incrementally. And I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think at some point you do hit a point where it feels like this is what we ought to be doing. This is how it's always been. I know it works. I've had experience doing it. You hit a little bit of a tipping point, but we haven't had a great way to quantify like where we are in waging that change battle, if you will. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I'm all over the place again, but I would say there's more openness than we would think, but a lot of times it's also, the technical work and strategies and tactics and showing some, kind of like small wins and success and momentum that can make the difference and make people think we ought to keep trying to do more of it.
It was something you said earlier about kind of blending or pushing back on the college, high school, college, and then kind of workforce track, and really trying to kind of maybe blend or create like a new model rather than it be so siloed, which is definitely a part of what we're trying to kind of uncover like in this work. So what is a program that is part of JFF's work and part of your work that really tries to kind of, instead of having those be so siloed, that is really trying to streamline it or cut out like, unnecessary parts?
So I'll go with the audacious version, then I can tell you about some of the work that's going on that actually resembles this and is pushing in that direction. We just published a paper. Well, it feels like I've been talking about it for a while now, but it's relatively new, I guess. It's still got captured the imagination of, educators, I would like to say, and some policymakers and influencers. That it's a paper called The Big Blur. And what we've really recommended is we've said, well, why do we have the high schools and colleges that we do today? And why have we structured the transition between the two and their relationship to career and work in the way that we have? It doesn't make sense anymore. We have a future of work with jobs. To get a good job, you need much higher level of skill and knowledge. and experience to be able to leap into that than the way that our education systems have been structured to produce. So what we said is, the challenge is, can you imagine an institution that was specially designed for older adolescents, like roughly ages 16 through 20, roughly grades 11 through 14, so the first 2 years of college, and create institutions that were specially designed to encompass their needs, and also that were co-designed with employers from a region who would say, like, this is what I need for future employees in terms of skill sets. And they would be working with higher ed institutions and K-12 educators to create something that would enable students to graduate. First of all, grade 14 would be the new grade 12. That's when you would graduate. You would graduate with some kind of post-secondary credential that would have value in the labor market, allow you to get a good job with a good wage and career advancement prospects. And also, if you wanted to keep going, you could keep doing that. But it would enable young people to kind of get out into the labor market earlier. It would also allow students, while they're in these experiences, to do some work while they're in school, some work-based learning, to connect learning and work. I've talked about the integration. Ideally, it would be paid internships on the job experiences. So these are that's kind of a notion. And we said, okay, look, that's the idea. Then therefore, what would governance need to look like? What would financing systems need to look like? What would staffing credentialing systems, accountability, et cetera, all those systems, if this were to be the new normal for high school and post-secondary and the way we structure them? So that's been the call. That's actually been something that people have called us and said, we're interested in doing that. How do we do it? And we actually have some laws that are enabling students to maybe blur those lines a little bit. So, there are a couple of examples, like, a couple of states reward school districts for having students who complete an associate's degree while they're in high school, or who get an industry certified credential that industry has approved. So, and they're rewarding districts for helping students, not just prepare ostensibly for what comes next, but for actually showing evidence that the students are prepared because they finish some, but before they leave high school. So it is, that is sort of the kind of radical push we're making, and we're sort of citing instances, now they're few and far between, of those kinds of policies and models, and saying, see, you should do more of that. You can do it. I think a state that has done a lot of this well at some scale, although it's a small state, but it's at considerable scale, is Delaware. I'll also talk about a bigger state too, but Delaware has not exactly done all this boundary blurring, if you will, but has created pathways with partnerships of the players that you would need: community college system, K-12 system, employers. They've had a couple of governors who have said, employers, you have to be partners in this. And they've designed these kind of career pathways that kind of go, it's a well-designed sort of grade 9 through the first year or two of college with a work-based learning experience. They've been at this for, I would say, now 7-8 years. And they have at least over half of their students in a career pathway like this as part of high school. And they're aiming for more. They're aiming for even more. So that's one example of a state that has started to move in this direction. It's not full blurring, but you can imagine, if every student was doing one of these experiences, wouldn't that in essence be a big blur? If they just started with practice and it's going to push the policies. So that's one example. There are others as well. I cite Texas. They've kind of taken a different approach through their small high school models, but at some point they're in such demand in that state that through early colleges, I don't know if you've heard of the IBM kind of early college model called P-Tech,
yep.
Which enables students by a 5th, 6th year of high school to earn an industry credential, recognized credential in IT, kind of parts of the same idea. Well, Texas is doing so many of these, and communities are demanding it, that it wouldn't surprise me, over the course of 20 years, they've already made a notable dent in their high school landscape. They're on their way to tipping that system to make a new normal for high schoolers. So anyway, I think that's kind of like how we talk about the world and what we're seeing and what we try to encourage people to do.
I'm excited because I hear almost, it's the crossover. I think of vehicles because my son is huge into cars. So it's like a crossover, vehicle in education and learning and in skill building. It does make sense. I love the community aspect. I've always personally thought that, okay, what really makes us a school, a good school or a highly rated school, and if we're going to go beyond the score, it's got to be beyond the score. It's, traditionally we've looked at, SAT scores or how many kids go to. We traditionally think if students win at school, they go to a four-year college. They're admitted, and then we really don't track to see if they even finish. We know a lot of them drop out of 1 or 2 years because they don't have that skill set that you have just identified in this crossover. I'm just going to call it a crossover. What is your belief in what schools are for?
This is going to be imperfect, but I think in the younger years, probably through most of middle school, if not all of it, a lot of education there's inherent value in the socialization aspect for our democracy, for citizenship, for, I think, literacy and numeracy, those are like foundational, and critical thinking, right? And problem solving. So those are core and foundational. I think as those young people become younger people, young adults, as you may have heard from my intimations earlier, if not being blunt about this, I think, they're ready. These young adults are ready much earlier than we think to launch into what comes next. From early, like it's a time to take them from early adolescence into older adolescence and adulthood. So that means it should be a chance to get connected to some possible version of their future selves, getting and with support of adults in the high school. So, and then you could connect it back to the academic disciplines. They're definitely use those experiences as case studies and reflection moments, and sort of say, well, what does history tell us about? What does sociology tell us about what you're experiencing? And like some of the best approaches of these, just for lack of a better word, kind of big blur antecedents or whatever. They do a great job of being explicit about that learning as well, taking it back to the academic. But it's really through the experience on the job, in a college classroom, not just college prep, but doing some college, And I think, taking that and also sort of elevating it and saying, well, what are you learning about learning?
Yeah.
And yourself as a learner, and like, how will you know what you don't know, and what are your strategies going to be for learning it? And I still use that skill today. I mean, granted, I'm in knowledge work, but I really do think it's safe to say that is a core lifelong learning skill, and you have to learn it like through application and reflection.
Yeah.
And I just don't think our secondary institutions are designed to do that right now. We still isolate young people and segregate that learning into abstraction, and don't worry, you'll be ready if you take this set of college preparatory courses. So well, that's my bias.
I'm with you.
When we're trying to create this big blur and, JFF is like in this work, when you're kind of starting this process, like what are some, I don't know, kind of like struggles? Like if somebody's trying to do this work, even on a small scale with like little experiments, what are some things that they might need to think through, some barriers that they might need to kind of overcome in order to create better partnerships, from the high school to the collegiate level, or collegiate level to the workforce, or just workforce across both of those levels? What would be some things that you would add to that conversation?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. this is the work, right? I mean, because we don't, in a way, our argument for the big blur is, you wouldn't have to work so hard on all these darn partnerships across K-12 communities, post-secondary institutions, employers, at the same time that we're saying you have to do those. Like, that's what it has been about. But, I think part of our motivation for doing the big blur was to sort of say, it shouldn't be this hard. It should just be the way the system is built. But suffice it to say, we live in our current reality. So I think that requires partnerships, and I think you have to have leaders. And I don't just mean the people at the top of the institutional food chain, right? But like even mid management, and then all the way down, like in the best of all worlds, everyone in a high school building, just for example, ought to understand like what the vision is for their school and be bought in. That's kind of step one. It can't just be one person's idea, notion to own. And then they need capacity, dedicated capacity. Like some of the best partnerships, guess what? They actually have people employed who are in charge of maintaining the partnerships and getting things done across institutional lines. It takes so much effort to, right now you have to build memoranda of understanding, right? About who's going to pay for what, who's qualified to teach what to whom. Those agreements have to be sorted out. Who's going to insure the student on, at the workplace, because the employer doesn't want to take liability for a 17-year-old. So how does that work? So you have to build like these kind of functions in the building to be able to manage and circumvent systems, answer questions, rewire, build bridges in different ways, put the Band-Aids on, if you will. Sorry to use a bad, like we have a sick patient here, but sometimes, that's our diagnosis sometimes. But it's all to say it takes capacity and investment in your partnerships to be able to build these kind of pathways, because short of having a system that just makes it happen on its own, you have to kind of create your own homemade, sort of community by community, institution by institution, partnership by partnership. And that takes, the reason I emphasized at the beginning, everybody in the building knowing, is eventually leaders leave. So if their vision leaves with them, so does a partnership. You have to rebuild the whole partnership often, right? So it helps if you have these redundancies. Everybody knows in all the different institutional bodies, like what this work is about. And they're going to agree to, like, we're going to continue to carry it on. There's going to be continuity in making the kinds of connections that we need to, having the agreements that we need to continue creating these kind of experiences for young people.
I love this. It's you can see the vision. I actually, I think a lot of the work that we do I'm starting a school year again, 21st one, and coming in from a business standpoint and building these relationships, it usually just kind of corners itself into some parts of the school and breaking these things down. What would you say to maybe an administrator, a school board member, somebody who what is the first step, and for working with your organization, what's the first steps that they should start to take a look at? I think it's an overwhelming thing. For me, I've always wanted to try to tear down the system and rebuild, and as I age out of the system and I keep going, it's frustrating. The little wins happen. I'm very, I kind of want to move to Delaware right now, but you see these things, which is great. But so we're outside of, a little bit of grassroots and piloting small things. Where do you take it from that point? What do you think is the next step? Because I think there are a lot of innovative teachers. Let me just preface this by, there's a lot of innovative teachers, right? And I think a lot of teacher burnout happens not because of maybe just pay or lack of respect, but it's actually there's lack of innovation. People are bored, after 5 or 10 years. I'm looking at Alli right now. No, but she's jumping out of airplanes, for crying out loud. No, but she is, though, by the way. But there is that. So what are maybe that step 2 that is in there? Or how can they maybe work with your organization or anybody to maybe get to just a small step two?
Yeah, well, first of all, be always happy to point folks to resources. We're, as I say, our work is national, so we work through partners and partnerships. It's a rare delight for me to be in schools and it happens. It's awesome to see, but I don't spend enough time there because I'm looking at the whole system and trying to change that. But that said, there are a lot of great organizations that are simpatico, that are allies of ours that are on board with these kinds of ideas. So depending on where folks are, I'd be happy to try to hook them up, if you will, through JFF. We have a great website, www.jff.org. But just to get practical for a second beyond that, real tactical, I would say, again, if there's a theme here, some of the best approaches I've seen that have grown up to be of a scale where we point to it and say, that's pretty big, is it starts modestly. Just don't let the current boxes and systems and constraints paralyze you from trying to set an audacious goal along these lines and sort of say, you know what, we want every student eventually, like let's say 10 years, right, in our school to graduate with an associate's degree or a post-secondary degree that has labor market value, including, in industry credentials that stack up to degrees, whatever the goal may be. I mean, that's one, as you can tell from our conversation, that's one I would cheer on. So what would that mean to start? Like, let's start with a cohort of ninth graders that are coming in now, or let's start with 2 classes of that cohort, whatever it is. I mean, I think the danger of that approach is if you just stick with that, you tend to end up being selective and having a boutique little program, right? For students who oftentimes could have benefited without it. They would have done just fine. Because that's what scale is. You're trying to reach everyone. But however you start, it's just a start, and then also starting with the end in mind. So wherever you start, even if it's small, you have a strategy for how to keep growing it. So there was a superintendent in South Texas who I still admire. He's retired now, but he ended up creating an early college school district. So all of the high schools in that district, it was a 30,000 student school district. So nothing to sneeze at, pretty large. And it took some years, but eventually got everyone on an early college path in those high schools. It was just expected, but started, started small, like in a small high school, and said, okay, we're going to do that. That was a typical early college approach, by the way, but he didn't want to stop there. He said, then in a year, I'm going to take my top teachers from that school and I'm going to assign them to one of our big high schools. And then we're going to create a couple of early college pathways in those, with those lead teachers being the leads, to show everybody else how to do it. And then we're going to expand that in that school to a couple of other pathways, eventually reach all the students. And then let's go to the other high school. So you get my drift. It wasn't exactly that way, but that was the spirit. Is he had a strategy for scale, but it started with what was practical at the time. And then he built up buy-in and excitement and know-how, and then built up that way. So I just think, you have to have some patience and continuity of vision and partnerships.
I like the and then is totally everything in scaling. I mean, and then. I love that you said that like 5 times, because you can visualize. I use that with students as well.
I really just like how you kind of set the stage for don't be paralyzed. I think that is something, don't be paralyzed from getting started, because that is something that I think school districts and school leaders face as a challenge because of the overwhelm and the lack of capacity. And so there really is this very large need for people to kind of step in, and policies, at a bigger level than just like the individual school level, right? It's great that principal had this vision for scale and could carry it. But a lot of our educational leaders and then big school districts they don't even have the time to sit down and think and plan and pursue these visions, even though I think most people would agree with the work that you're doing and that it's needed. And we need alternative pathways, and we need different ways to kind of get kids excited to learn. And it doesn't need to be this traditional box model of a seven class day, you know, with bouncing around from room to room just to get your high school diploma, to then get into college, to then take, you know, however 15 to 18 credits for 4 years and get a piece of paper that says you know English well. There's so many opportunities that are missed in that model, but it's like, so I don't know, behemoth at times, that it can seem like, oh, well, why should I even start? I love to say, you know, like, how do you eat an elephant? Right. One bite at a time.
Yes.
And I really like that the what you're kind of getting at seems to be that approach. And so you've kind of talked about this in some of your answers here, but I think a question that Peter and I love to ask is, you know, like, okay, so dream it up, right? Get your mind right for this. If you could design your own educational system, not even within the confines of JFF and like the ways you're kind of like working now, but if you could design a system of the future, like, what would it look like? What would learning look like? Go.
No pressure.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll harken back to some themes from this call. I mean, as you can hear, I have a passion around that older high school youth and what it looks like, you know, the education during, with an eye on like what happens next. And I think it should be, you know, we design it so it's much more experiential. I'm going to suspend my disbelief about current master scheduling systems and all the constraints we talked about that can paralyze you, right? But that you would have, you know, more spaces and adults and institutions in the community that see themselves and have a part, you know, see as part of their role as being learning institutions for young people, you know, and how we get, you know, how we get to that place. Like, I think museums, right, are much more apt to sort of think of themselves that way. Oh, okay. They still don't do as much as, you know, they could in my imaginary world. Libraries, you know, they're community institute. I mean, there's some strong youth organizations in communities that, you know, really teach young people more arguably than sometimes than what they get in school. I mean, I'll say it, right? And then but like, how do we then credit that? So, you know, young people would get sort of those experiences validated in some way. And we would kind of make sure that sort of unofficial like teaching force, right, gets accredited in some way, right? Because we want this to be, you want people to go to quality providers, if you will. But we would have a much expanded set of resources that I think are untapped right now, and that, you know, you would have young people working together from the same, you know, cohorts to work on and try and solve community problems under the guidance, you know, of mentors with professional experience. So it'd be like, you know, project-based learning, but not in the abstract. Like, actually, you're doing a consultancy and trying, you know, and you know, maybe your project actually would have some results, you know, but you would be really like, make it as authentic and experiential and as consequential and validated as possible. I think when everybody gets bought into the idea of like, you know, young people can do some powerful stuff, then we might see this, you know, ecosystem opening up a bit more that way. You know, short of that, I think, hearkening back to my earlier theme, I think employers can be doing much more of this, and post-secondary institutions working with K-12.
Yeah.
Let's at least start there. But I think, you know, you asked me to dream big, so I would say there are a whole set of other resources that we could be leveraging
Right. I think, and in addition to that, what does the student think? What is their narrative? How are they unpacking this? Even if something fails, like in a community or a project, like how are they learning through that? I mean, that's something like we do at Spikeview, but like how are they building, their own narrative and then showing? I think there's a lot of equity issues that can be resolved in that as well, where you can really get in the head of that young person or that young learner. It's amazing. I love what you do. Joel, I want to take a moment and just thank you for sharing your lens, sharing, the amazing things you're doing at JLFF. It's jff.org. How else can people, kind of start to learn more about JLFF, the jobs for the future, and even connect with you?
Well, if you go to that website, you'll see my bio and my contact information. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I'm out there. I mean, that's part of my job, is to be connecting with folks. I'm always happy to network and connect people with other folks. It's just, I don't know all the answers, and there are plenty of folks that I still learn from. I mean, that's what gives me energy, is, finding out about a new innovator in the field and saying, that is so interesting. How can we figure out a way to partner and make some change? Sign up for our newsletter. I think there's a spot there on the website. Stay abreast of all the work that we're doing there, and keep on listening to podcasts like this. Peter and Alli, this is a great platform. I know you're trying to make sure that people are aware of all that's going on out there. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and share today.
Thank you so much.
So much.
Yeah.
Yes, we really, really, really enjoyed hearing your thoughts, and just from someone deep and entrenched in the work that we really want to do more of, and show people here just what it could look like, and that there are places where it is being done.
And I'm glad you said optimist, because on a previous episode we were talking about optimism versus pessimism. Thank you for being an optimist. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next time on Disrupt Education.